When I wrote my book in 1989, times were very different in terms of how culture was viewed and how diversity was viewed. If you asked a white person, what does it mean to be white? They would say, I don't know what it means to be white. I don't think of myself as white. I think of myself as Italian or Irish or some ethnic group. And they were puzzled about what it meant, and they did not want to talk about it. Now, race is everywhere. We talk about it a great deal, much more so even since we now have an African American president. But we also have become very aware of the complexities involved in understanding cultural backgrounds, because ethnicity is not race, even though we always talked about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. White people hadn't thought about what it meant to be white, or couldn't speak about it. Now I think there is much more clarity about what has it meant to be white, what is it meant to be a person of color, which for people of color is not who they are ethnically. And that's another whole issue, how people of color have been lumped together as not being white when they actually have very strong identity in terms of who they are ethnically. So they have more clarity, I think, about the separation than actually white people do. Some white people still have their ethnic culture, but others who have been in the country, say, 4 or more generations, or they have been intermingled, are less clear or less fundamentally connected to their ethnicity of European origin. So much has changed in terms of how we understand these complexities, and we understand that we need to think a lot about it. We need to be totally clear on it when we think about who we are and what it means to be who we are and how it has influenced our behaviors and our values and all of that. There is much more readiness to open this up, to look at it, and try to come to grips with it.
It seems like that whole dynamic of white and black in the United States has done so much damage, really, in terms of giving people this sense that there's a political or cultural need separate from what they really feel as human beings to identify with these terms that are so general and really somewhat meaningless in the terms of how one sees oneself. Of course, they have extreme power in American culture, power to empower or power to disempower. But what you said really struck with me when I think of my own family, and I think of how my father's family, for instance, had a very strong ethnic identity as French-speaking Louisiana Creoles, which was a separate issue from whether or not one was black or white. As part of a broader black community, they understood their position in that. But that didn't really explain anything about their language, their religion, their traditions, because that was much more complicated. But they didn't really have a language for describing themselves that way, or they were really often in this tug of war between sharing a broader black identity, which had some very important aspects and very important implications for their lives, but also being proud of their ethnic identity, which they felt they really weren't allowed to celebrate to the same degree, or when they did, it was often seen as trying to disengage from their black identity. So it really created this confusion and separation, but now I see a lot more embracing of both in a much healthier way, at least. That's the way it appears.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying because my mother also had that identity. She was from Louisiana and had that background. What often happened with people who were not from that background, who were also African American, was that there was a feeling you didn't want to be African American because you wanted to really honor your cultural heritage. And that is totally not understood about a lot of people. I just came from a conference, the Multicultural Family Therapy Training Center in New Jersey, and Latinos were talking about how one of them spoke. She said, I am Puerto Rican, and when I came to this country, I could not believe what confronted me. She said, where I came from, we saw ourselves as Taino, which meant Native American, Indian, as African, and also Spanish. And we were all three of those. When I come here, I am a person of color. That is my designation. Not even, and then she said, and when they say that we are Latinos, we are not descendants of Spanish only. We are descendants of 3 different streams. And so this is very confusing for us and very oppressive, is what she said.
Interesting. So do you think the multiracial identity that seems to be blossoming in the United States now, and certainly is a more realistic understanding of who we are as people, do you think that will be a real positive change going forward, or will it cause a lot of confusion?
I think it could be a very positive change, but you're going to find a tremendous backlash from African Americans who feel that politically this will divide them.
Right.
And that is the craziness of race and the power that race has to split people and confuse them.
Absolutely. That's always been the concern, I think, because in order to fight discrimination and segregation, we had to aggregate these people of color to produce a political coalition to get non-white, or get white people to see, at least in the political sense, that there was a problem, and to get them to recognize that that problem needed immediate attention. Now that some of the most basic problems have been solved, and we start to celebrate these other identities, will we fall into the trap that some other nations have fallen into? Actually, a lot of nations that have a very multi-ethnic history, that, well, we don't have racial problems because we all celebrate our multi-ethnic pasts, but indeed, when you look closer, you do see that racial problems remain, and color does still matter.
And color still matters.
Yeah, I've often spent a lot of time thinking about that in reference to places like Brazil, and even in places in Europe like France that are seeing their populations really change. The introduction of communities from North Africa, and the French would say, well, we don't even do statistical collections of racial identities because there is no race in France other than being French. But indeed, of course, on the ground, race really does matter, and people do face discrimination because of how they look or because of their religion. So this is such a difficult problem to really penetrate. But my sense is the fact that, at least in this country, that we are much better able to recognize that the person we see is often a product of many different cultural influences, and we can celebrate that. It makes for a much healthier understanding of identity.
If we can, each one of us, accept the ways in which we are uniquely cultural, because we are different culturally even from someone who shares our own ethnicity.
Right.
But we are often unable to accept that. So hopefully this thrust that you're speaking of will help us to become more able to accept each person's uniqueness at the same time that we can join together, work together for a common cause.
Absolutely.
Privilege has an effect on effective practice for social workers in several different ways. In the first place, when people have privilege, they often don't really know that the true significance of the fact that they have that privilege. They might know they are privileged, but they have no understanding of what that has meant to those over whom they have a privilege. They have not opportunity to know that because privilege tends to segregate itself, tends to want to be separate, because in the interaction there can be pain, there can be guilt, there can be fear, and so in order to be comfortable, it's better to be separate. Let's have gated communities so that we can be separate and we won't have to face what the benefit of our privilege enables us to have. So being privileged, and I always tell my students that it's not just white people that are privileged. African Americans have privilege in some ways. I grew up as such a person, so I'm aware of that. It's many other, in other ways people are privileged, but privilege allows you not to know about it, not to think about it. At the same time, that if you are a professional service provider, you are in a privileged role. You have power. So you are doubly privileged in that encounter. And that means you have to think on two levels about what this privilege means. That's what I've tried to teach my students.
Your work on privilege is so important for professionals of all kinds. I mean, when I think about law students and educating them, this issue is extremely important because some of my students will end up only dealing with people of privilege, and it can become a real distortion in their lives because they leave a relatively privileged home environment to go to school in a relatively privileged environment, to enter into practice, say, with a large corporate law firm where all their clients are people of privilege for the most part. And they forget almost entirely how to deal with the realities of other people's lives, and that can become a real burden for them later on. But in the best of cases, the students have opportunities during school to think a little bit more about these questions as you've described them. And what comes to my mind is a situation I've seen with students who go and do clinical legal services in underprivileged communities. And they find often that things that happen to them there are very transformative. I recall an incident with a student who was always upset that his client was late. He was working in a neighborhood legal services center. And he couldn't understand why the client would be late all the time. And then one day the client missed an appointment, and he just hit the roof because he said, I'm trying to help you, and you don't come to appointments, and you're late all the time. But he did have the presence of mind to sit down with the client and ask why that was happening. And as it turns out, the client was about to be evicted from her apartment. And so she prioritized saving herself from eviction ahead of making her appointments at legal services. And she was spending time collecting money. Every time she had an opportunity to ride the bus for the appointment, she would stop and collect money from friends and relatives along the way, and then pay her rent. That was her reality. And when he heard that reality, and when he saw the fact that just maintaining a place to live for some people becomes the core focus of their day, his whole view on how she interacted with him changed. So I think giving students an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations and to step back from how they consider just basic issues of time and space even in their privileged world vis-a-vis the worlds of others is really important.
Of course, social workers deal with that all the time. And so we have to teach that in our class over and over again to our students, because many of the clients, the people that are served, are people who have those kinds of realities. And we need to understand that people respond to their realities in the best way they can. Their behavior has meaning. And so we try to understand that what we are looking at represents a person's effort to get along, to survive.
Mm-hmm. In the work that you do you find that you encounter this problem that I often see? I often see students who have the best of intentions and recognize their privilege and want to serve or help others to account for that. But they often then use service or assistance as not so much a way of engaging people who have less or people who are different, and then using it to transform themselves, but often see this more as a way of ennobling themselves and not really any meaningful engagement with the other person. And really, it's not limited to students. I see it all the time with all kinds of people, but this sense of, I'm a good person because I help those in need, or I am engaged with the underprivileged, look at me, although they don't do that in an explicit way. And the person on the other side is sometimes completely forgotten because the whole exercise is really about the individual providing the help.
That touches a fundamental theme in social work, which has been respecting the right of the client to determine his life, to be able to function in a way that he can get his own needs met. And so very often we see social workers who think that they are helping the client to become independent, to become able to function effectively and meet his needs independently and with dignity, when in actuality they are doing for the client. They are labeling them, they are diagnosing them, they are telling them what they need rather than listening to them and hearing what it is the client says he needs, and then functioning in a way to give him information about what he can do to solve his problem. So it's not, we work very hard not to do for people or do to people, but to do with them.
Right, right. Well, you know, in the context of legal education, issues of race and power and privilege are everywhere, and they can often be a source of great stress and turmoil in educational settings, as well as great opportunities for learning. I can recall from my own law school experience the difficult conversations we would have, say, in a criminal law class around issues of race, because there were so many assumptions that even in very quote-unquote liberal environments that would suddenly become obvious, and students would just react, you know, with rage sometimes as to what they actually heard their classmates saying. I think that's gotten a lot better. I think students are a lot more aware of the different types of communities in our society. But just yesterday I did a panel at the law school on the Trayvon Martin case with a number of my colleagues, a panel that the students organized. The Black Law Students Association organized it, but many, many students participated. And it was very interesting to me to see how this story never goes away, this story about how the law deals with cultural views of the other, and the recognition that there is an other. So for many of the white students in the group that we presented to, it was really hard for them to realize that, yes, indeed, they made a lot of assumptions about Trayvon Martin that troubled them. But what was more interesting was for me, for instance, to tell the students how I, as an African-American man and the parent of 3 African-American boys, have to educate and school them on their behavior in public still in 2012 because of that very fear that all people of color have, that someone will judge them purely on their look and perhaps do something lethal or fatal to them. That's the worst case scenario, but getting students to recognize that people live in these realities that affect how they view the law, affect how the law deals with them, or how people who enforce the law deal with them, is incredibly important. And I think we've made a lot of progress on getting people to step away for a moment from how they see a situation as the person they are and engage for a moment with the reality of the person who may be different. But it's a very, very difficult process. We're constantly trying to come up with ways in law school to provide opportunities for conversations around these topics. Because I think the more the students and the faculty talk about it, the easier it gets. Race doesn't become a taboo subject, or class, or linguistic differences, religion. All of these things become flashpoints in so many issues in the law. If we were talking about immigration law, for instance, you know, there are a lot of stereotypes and political ideologies and things that come out in just a basic discussion of how you proceed with an immigration case. So what we found is setting up opportunities for real, relaxed conversations when issues come up or when the students themselves feel the need to talk about them has been a great way of humanizing these discussions. And so when we deal with the legal implications, the students already have a vocabulary to think about a respectful and interactive way to talk about ethnic difference, racial difference, class difference.
Engaging in a conversation and trying to understand the other person's point of view, the other person's experience, and how that person has gotten to believe and think the way he has is critical in the training of any professional. It's certainly what we feel we have to do with social work. But what you just said helps me to deal with a prejudice I have against lawyers. Now, I have a lawyer in my family, you understand. But I see lawyers as trained to be adversarial and to win. And when I'm in trouble, I want a lawyer who can do that.
Right.
I desperately want that. And I've had occasion to need that. But I believe that when you're taught to be adversarial, so much of the time, that when it comes to really standing back, listening to the other person, empathizing with the other person, trying to see what their experience has meant to them, it's very hard to do when you've been trained to be adversarial. I think that is true in so many ways of many professions who are taught to be the experts. And so when they engage with people that they are serving or want to help, they are not ready to let the person be the expert on himself and what he or see, why his experience has led him to think and be the way he is. For social workers, it's even harder because many of our clients have reacted to the entrapment that they live in in ways that have been the best they could, but which compound their entrapment, which make things harder for them. They end up in jail, they end up in trouble, they end up ill, whatever. And social workers have to help them deal with these attitudes, these belief systems, these behaviors, but in ways that are respectful and that empathize with how they got there in the first place. And that's a tall order.
Well, that's really difficult. And I think when we're thinking about privilege and cultural competence in the setting of law school, we're constantly wondering and working toward a model that does all of the things that you've been describing. Well, one thing, Elaine, that you commented on had to do with the adversarial nature of the law. And actually that goes directly to the issue of cultural competence, because some of the ways we view the legal professional are actually rooted in a certain cultural vision of what a lawyer is supposed to be like, and in a certain cultural vision of how the law is supposed to work. And I think as the culture has changed and as people from different backgrounds are entering into roles that had heretofore been barred to them, the idea of who a lawyer is and how a lawyer works and what a lawyer is supposed to do has started to change. So one thing, for instance, that we're seeing not only from legal professionals but from their clients is a request for lawyers who are trained in dispute resolution techniques that do not involve adversarial tactics. In the past, we really trained most of our lawyers to see themselves as engaged in a court battle, very sort of traditionally English way of understanding the role of the lawyer, something we adopted and modified. But most lawyers really never go to court, and most disputes are not resolved in court, and most clients don't want their disputes ever to go to court. They want to resolve issues before that point, or even better, they want issues to be anticipated so that we don't even get to the point of having a dispute. If I know what my client wants, if I know what my client's goals are for a particular transaction or a particular issue, there are lots of things I can do to prevent that issue from becoming a dispute. And interestingly, being more culturally competent is critically important in that process, because my clients are coming from many different places now. They aren't all alike. And so as the makeup of corporations changes, as more international issues become a part of every lawyer's practice, as we see the communities in which we live change in their ethnic and racial makeups, we really have to understand the different ways that people engage dispute resolution or problem solving, and think in a broader way as to how we want to see the lawyer's role in those contexts. So this openness that we have seen over the last 25, 30 years to a much more multicultural society has also helped prepare us for the reality of a more multicultural society and a more multicultural bar and a much more international practice of law.
The fight for civil rights affected me in a lot of ways. I grew up in Washington, D.C., in a segregated community, in an excellent school system. But within that segregated community, I did not have a realistic picture of myself, my family, my community, because I had no way to engage with white people to check it out. So, yes, we tried to be proud of who we were, and yes, we tried to be effective and successful But we had no idea that this school system that I went to was one of the best. The schools were some of the best that there were, not just in Washington, but in the country. And I did not find out how well prepared I was until I went to graduate school and had to compete. So I've learned some things about doubting yourself, accepting, or yes, trying to fight stereotypes, but nevertheless, some of it got to you. I also learned how quickly, when there is hope, people who have felt terrified of taking a stand for their own rights will stand up and be courageous, will come forth and grow and develop and change and be able to function very well in the larger society. I also learned that some of us have been so damaged that we need tremendous help now that the gates are opened. There are ways in which their responses to their entrapment are further entrapping them, and that's something that we have to work on.
Well, as a child of sort of young civil rights movement folk, what I took from my experience was interesting too. I had so many of the benefits of the work of people like you and my parents. And for my parents, they were sort of the last generation to be educated in segregated schools when almost immediately upon their graduation from college, the society, at least the laws changed, partially due to things due to risks they took in college and after. But I also remember a kind of exhaustion. You always felt like you were working. The expectations that were placed on them and on us consequently just seemed to be, one, incredibly high, which I appreciate, but two, sometimes almost superhuman. You know, you're the first or one of the few black families in a particular suburb or a particular school. Everyone's looking at you. Your parents want you to do everything right. The teachers are watching you with eagle eyes. The other students are trying to suss out whether or not you're, or what kind of black person you really are. And so increasingly you're putting on this mask that's designed to kind of move you through this brave new world of integration. And you sometimes start to lose a sense of your own reality. So even though segregation had these limits, it kind of created a reality that you knew and you understood. It seemed that every year of my growing up, my siblings and I were engaging in something that was new and baffling to my parents. I mean, we would be having these experiences, of course, that they had never had or weren't allowed to have. And even if they'd had them, they had them at very different stages in their lives. So yes, they went to college in an integrated setting, but we were doing it in kindergarten. And they were having engagements with parents that were foreign to both sides. I remember a funny story of my mother taking me to a nursery school in Atlanta. And she was working with a group of young mothers, very integrated. Everyone thought they were so interesting and liberal. And they had formed this preschool, integrated preschool in Atlanta in the 60s, late 60s. And the teacher with whom, a person that my mother was relatively close to, encountered something that any nursery school teacher would have encountered. One of the little white girls told her that she was going to marry me. And that just blew her mind. She just didn't understand how to deal with that. So she got a little black rabbit and a little white rabbit and put them in a cage. And when the rabbits had babies, some were white, some were black, and some had spots. And she said, you know, it's okay for white children and black children to get married, but some of the children may have spots.
She tried.
She tried.
She was trying.
And my mother raced in and said, what have you done? And she was so embarrassed. And my mother laughed about it. They said, you know, in the world from which they had come, that was just a question that would never have come up. And she just had this very sort of juvenile reaction, but it was new. And so, you know, you were constantly dealing, I mean, that's a funny and maybe kind of strange example, but you were constantly dealing with, do you know if these parents are going to want you around their kids? And if they do, are they going to treat you well? And is the school going to really give the black children what they need to go to the kinds of colleges their parents want them to go to? I mean, it's a constant struggle. So at the end of all that, by the time I got to college, I realized, you know, I was kind of a tense person. You know, I had really been sort of fortified to be in a position of kind of on the edge of battle. It was not always necessary, but you know, you just didn't want to let your guard down, and it's kind of hard to go through life like that all the time. So, you know, I really appreciate the struggles of people now who are coming in. I feel a real kinship with immigrants who are trying to penetrate a new society, because I think I understand something of what they're going through or what their children are going through, because I sort of see my parents as like something akin to first-generation immigrants in an integrated society. You know, finding that sense of commonality really allows you in your own work to be a much more sensitive listener and to be a much more, I don't know, I feel much more empowered now to help people through my own experiences and to be, you know, more sympathetic and empathetic to the kinds of things that they deal with.
Being the first or among the first is an awesome price to pay. And we don't think of it, but we want to be, we will do it anyway, but we sometimes aren't able to prepare our children or ourselves for being the first. I remember an incident in my daughter's life. She went to college. She had gone to, like you, she had gone to an integrated school. And now it was Black Power time. So, and this was a big challenge for African American middle class kids, trying to find out where they were in this Black Power movement. So when we drive to the university, they have, and this is in the 70s, they have all of the black students living in one dorm at this time. So we drive up and the music is blaring and the curtains are hanging out of the windows and the kids are having a great time, and my daughter says, I'm home with my people. So 6 weeks later, she's moving out. What? You are moving out? Well, they say we're too bougie, and because we want to study and want to get good grades. So 6 of my friends, my black friends, we're going to move to we're going to make a ghetto and a white dorm. Now that actually happened.
Wow.
To my daughter. This is what some people went through trying to find their way in this new culture that was evolving. The cost was tremendous for some people. I remember a newspaper woman in Chicago who had grown up this way. She was very committed to the black cause, but it ended up costing her life. She committed suicide because the stresses were just too much. She was feeling that she had to write about it, she had to understand it. and it overtook her.
Well, I'm really glad you raised this issue of class within the African American community, and this idea of, you know, the bourgeois blacks and the inner city blacks, and because of course when the schools are admitting us at that time, they just wanted more black people, and the differences in our experiences as a group really weren't on the radar screen at all. And I remember that very vividly from college as well, going to what was called the Third World Transition Week before college, which was a really, I think, heartfelt attempt by, you know, Brown University at the time to make sure that the students of color had a good transition into the university. But for those of us who were there, it revealed this extraordinary sense of differences that we had. Middle class black kids from the suburbs, inner city Latino kids, you know, black kids from small southern towns who rarely ever saw white people. I mean, it was really an extraordinary mix, and not necessarily one that was going to create a positive group environment. And so that whole crisis around identity, I think particularly for middle class African American kids in the 70s and 80s, was huge. I mean, who are you supposed to hang out with? What are you supposed to dress? How are you supposed to dress? What are you supposed to say? How are you supposed to speak? You know, you'd been pushed by your parents to be, you know, the best on anyone's scale, and then suddenly you're in a group that's trying to tell you that that's wrong, that's white, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be like them, whoever they are. And you know, I think one of the tragedies of that time, I mean, given all of its successes, there were these little tragedies of no one was really, I think, that clued in to the amount of energy that these kids of color were spending negotiating all of that stuff, you know. And it's not surprising, I think, sometimes that, you know, things like academic performance suffered, or the emotional state of many of us was constantly tested, because, you know, we were dealing with so many different cultural and social issues beyond the academic ones. You know, something had to give. And I think for some people, you know, the cost was really, really high. I'm glad to see that seems to be less of a problem now. I think more kids don't have to deal with that. But it would really be interesting, I think, to see some more work done on what that period really meant for, you know, sort of the children of civil rights and their children, because there was a lot going on that I think was very much under the radar.
Well, I think we have to marshal the information about their realities and their history. You know, the reason that they are trapped is that our history books have never told the truth about what has actually happened to people in this country. And for that reason, there has not been the national will to marshal the resources and the programs to change the way that people are trapped, to enable them to have the services that will free them to grow and be able to meet their needs and live effective lives in this society. What we need to do is to change the way that we teach history, change the way that we teach about the realities of the people that are trapped, and offer them services that will help them to become the citizens they can be.
Yeah, I would like to see us, moving on from that, take a much closer look at the power that is represented by our increasing diversity, and to see what kind of nation we can become in the 21st century that deals much more effectively with the reality of a globalized economy and a much more global or a smaller global environment because of technology, because of the movements of people. I read a piece recently, I think in the New York Times, that suggested that more and more young people who come from, ethnic identities or recently that are connected to a recent immigration in their family, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, see opportunities for themselves in the countries from which their parents came, but also see themselves as strongly rooted to the United States. And that, to me, represents a wonderful opportunity for the future, that this would be a country where people can come and be part of the fabric of this society, recognized in all their dignity and all their diversity, but who will also provide a bridge to other societies that can really be the beginnings of a much more healthy dialogue between the United States and other parts of the world, particularly parts of the world that have these major emerging economies like Asia and Africa and Latin America. So the demographic change that we see in our country, a change that so many people are reacting to with fear, I think is a change that is loaded with incredible possibility and hope. And if we could tap into that potential and present a story more in line with the possibilities that would help this country maintain and perhaps even increase its greatness as a nation, I think that we'd be doing a great service to everyone.
I think that it's been a mental health issue for me to take those stands. I guess you have to go back to my confusion when I was growing up about the whole issue of race. When I was in graduate school in 1945, I chose as my thesis an understanding of the meaning of being Negro as seen through parental handling of minority group status. In other words, I was interviewing black people about their experiences and what does it mean to be who you are. Well, I guess you know that at the end of of the semester, I didn't finish my thesis because they couldn't help me. There was not enough in the literature to even buttress it with any theory, So, and the reason for my choosing that is deep and long and complex in terms of my own family dynamics. But I was trying to deal with the confusion. I learned early that when I was confronted with contradictions and paradoxes, which I think everyone is confronted with, but I do believe that for people who have been in subordinate positions, there are many more. I learned that the way to deal with that, instead of getting a stomach ache or something else, taking a drink, to write it down. And so writing it down helped me to think about it, look at it, work on it, and I found that if I wrote about it, if I took my stand, that it was better for my mental health.
And better for all the rest of us.